right, it's so great to see so many people in this room. It's going to be a fun discussion, so let's share the screen, and you can also ask questions afterwards as well. So the talk's title is From Patchwork to Picasso. I had a friend back in my first company who we used to call the patch guy, because he would always patch code and it would break the next day. But let me ask you a question. A very important question indeed. What if you had cats? How many of you have cats? Can you raise your hands? I can't see anyone, but okay. What if you had 150 plus of them? And what if you tried to walk them at once? All going in different directions, completely out of control. Chaotic, but fun. That's exactly how I felt. And for the next half an hour, this is what we are going to talk about. So, a bit of my introduction that has been already given. I'm Mohammed Ahsan Ayaz. You can call me Ahsan. I'm a Google developers expert in Angular for the past 6 years. I'm a software architect at Scania. And I'm a founder at VisionWise and IOMX. I'm also the author of 2 worldwide published books. As the gentleman said, one of them is the Angular Cookbook. The second one is also the Angular Cookbook. It's the second edition that I'm going to talk about. So let me take you back to 2019. Let me tell you a story. In 2019, a really cool company named Pact reached out to me and said, do you want to create a video course with us? And that was on Ionic. How many of you know about Ionic? Cool, a couple of them. When I heard about this, I was really excited, and I could not hold my tears because I always wanted to create video courses. I was always about education. My mom has been a teacher. My uncles have been teachers as well. So it runs in the family, you can say. So inspired by great tutors like John Papa, Dan Wallin, Todd Motto, who I have been looking up to while I was learning Angular, I thought this is a great chance for me. But there was a challenge. And that was, I used to live with my family in Pakistan back then. And if it comes as a surprise to you, that's fine. But we usually live in joint family system in Pakistan, which is actually preferred way. So we live with our father, mother, brothers, all in the same house. However, when you do that, you only have so much space to yourself. So I had only one room, and that is essentially my bedroom. So I used to record all of my videos for this course at the night time. When everybody else is sleeping, I have the time to myself. But you can imagine having just one room and recording, I faced some challenges. When I tried to record from my bedroom, since I was just married and didn't have a lot of money, the room was almost empty. I did not have a lot of furniture, which means that whenever I would speak, the sound would bounce from the walls, and that would create a lot of echo for me. It grew so much that when my wife was sleeping and she would just turn on the bed, that would be recorded, and that would piss me off so much. So what I tried to do is, I actually tried to go outside in the living room. Since everyone would be sleeping, that was the perfect place for me. But as you can see in the screen, it had a window that was just pointing outside of the house. So on and off, whenever I was recording, I would hear some sounds. Which sounds? That's when I was recording around 4 a.m. That's when I was recording not at 4 a.m., but night. And that would make me angry. Fortunately, I moved to Sweden in 2019. And you can see how happy I was. So once I published the course successfully, I thought it's going to be money all over me. However, something happened. It was a time when React Native came out. And since it was faster, it was native, a lot of people jumped on the bandwagon, and it didn't really work out as well as I thought. However, the next year, Pact reached out to me again. And they asked if I would be interested in writing an Angular book. So long story short, I actually wrote a book. It took me over 10 months, and we sold over 2,000 copies over the years for the first edition only. In late 22, they reached out again, and they were like, we want to build a new book with you, and we want it because the first one performed really well. And I thought that would be easy, because they just wanted a new edition of the book, which means that I'm not supposed to create a lot of new content, but I can just update what has been updated in a year or so, and that should be easy. And most of the work would be the same. But when I looked at the code base myself again, I knew I was in trouble. Because for the book itself, I had 150 plus projects. There were about 86 recipes in the book. So you have a problem, like how to implement Angular animations on a list. You start with the problem, you solve the recipe, and then you get to the solution. So there were 2 projects for every recipe, the start and the final. So for 86, almost 150 plus. When I looked at these projects, every project was just waiting to be updated from version 12 to version 16, because that has been changing. And if you know, when you want to update an Angular application, you have to go one version at a time, from one major version to the other one. And the problem would not just stop there. Angular has a release frequency, which is really predictable. So every 6 months, there's a major release. We also have minor releases as well, about 3. And I needed to make sure that whatever I'm doing is a bit future-proof as well. But I was really determined. I was like, I'm going to update all the recipes. However, it's going to be really slow. I have 150 projects, and updating them one by one from version 12 to version 16, you can imagine that would be painful. So what I do was I found out a really good tool that already has been spoken about today. It's called NX, the monorepository tool. However, just NX was not good enough for me. I had to do much more. So what I did basically is I decided to have one monorepository. And when I say monorepository, I mean one GitHub repository, not NX monorepo. So one GitHub repository with 2 NX workspaces. So from my 150 projects, we went to 2 workspaces in this case. One workspace for the starter files and one for the final state of all the projects. This was the structure or architecture that I went for. The monorepo having 2 folders, and in each folder we had chapters. So the book has 14 different chapters ranging from component communication to state management to Redux to unit testing, end-to-end testing, progressive web apps, you name it. But I wanted this structure still to be there. I wanted the chapters having the recipes. So let me ask you this question. How many of you love UI, UX? Raise of hands. Are they all backend engineers here or what? Okay, good. How many of you want a good UI, UX of the applications you use? Okay, so more of users here. Okay. How many of you advocate for great developer experience for yourself or others? Oh, good. Awesome. So that was my goal for myself as well, because I was now about to work with 150 projects. And I also wanted my readers to have a great developer experience as well while they're reading the book and following some commands or running them. So with the current NX structure, this is what happened. We had one GitHub repository, 2 folders representing 2 NX monorepositories. When I started to run any recipe or to start a project from my book, the readers would have to run something like this. Since we had 2 folders, they would have to cd into the folder, and then they would have to run something like nx serve, and then this name. I want you to have a close look at the name that they would have to type for each recipe. You can see that every recipe now that they have to work with has to have the chapter name within and the recipe name as well. And as we know, as developers, we want to be dry. Don't repeat yourself at all. But I also want you to remember what we really need is a great developer experience, the DX. You need to remember that. I'm going to ask you about that later. So the first goal was to enable the readers to do this in my journey. I wanted them to be able to run a command without having to cd into the folder. I wanted them to be just on the top of the GitHub repository and say npm run serve and then give the name. The second goal for me, for them, was to avoid having them to type the chapter number at all. Why? Because each recipe is absolutely unique. There's only one recipe for animating list. There's only one recipe for dog mode in progressive web apps. Only one recipe for optimizing Angular application using on-push strategy, and so on. So using the chapter names is redundant. We don't want that. So the first goal, it was really easy. I just wrote a bash script in which I did what I wanted them to do, cd into it, and then running a command. And then I used that shell script into my package.json, so I can just run npm run serve, and that runs the shell script behind the scenes. Pretty easy. And this is pretty cool what you can come up with programming when you want to shorten things down. You can also write your own scripts the same way. With this change, I did not have to do cd at all. I could just run this command, npm run serve, chapter blah, 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 recipe blah, 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 and then it would run it. Now I had to focus on the second goal. How do we have it in a way that they don't have to write the chapter name or the chapter number at all? To avoid using the chapter name, I had 3 possible situations when creating new projects. And remember, I haven't created any projects in my GitHub repository at all. I'm starting from scratch. I'm about to create 150 projects in an NX Mono repository. I'm going to copy paste a lot of code, of course, from my previous GitHub repo, but I had to build everything from scratch. And there are a few reasons more for that I'm going to talk about. So the first possibility was, when I'm creating a project, I'm excluding the chapter name before it has been created. The second possibility was renaming the project after it has been created. And the third was to just give up and write a PHP book instead. So yeah, I did not go for the third one. I went for the second one. Why? Any guesses? I don't know. I had zero idea what I was doing. No clue at all. I did not know a lot of things that I got to know after I was done with all of this. So coming back to the problem, to be able to do this for the readers, just run npm run serve and give a recipe name, I created my own NX plugin. And you might have heard about a lot of NX plugins yourself. When you create an Angular application, you're actually running an NX plugin. When you create a React application inside NX, you run a plugin, or you run something from a plugin. Same goes for storybooks, same goes for other things. So I created my own project, or my own plugin, and the reason for doing this was, let's see how I used to create applications back then. Just like the readers, I was going to go into the start folder, and I would do, hey, NX, create a new application for me. And I would do npx, nx, generate, blah, 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 this whole command. Now, I had to create 50 or 150 plus projects for this matter. And doing this all the time, I could probably save some time in this case. When I do run this particular command, this would generate the app with this particular name. Look at the command that I'm running and the last parameter of it. I say to NX from the start folder, create an app inside this path, chapter 1, and then the recipe name. What NX does is that it removes all the slashes, converts to dashes, and then makes that the application name. That was the exact problem I was trying to solve, to not have the chapter name at all. But since I can't really solve it while I'm creating it, I had to do with the second approach, that is, first create it, and then rename it somehow. If my readers would have to remember all the chapter numbers, this is what they would do. I don't want them to do that. So the plugin that I created had 2 different sort of components to it. The first one was an NX generator, and the second one was an NX executor. How many of you know about both of them, or how they work? OK, so you're at the right place then. The first thing was the generator. A generator is used to create files, to create different files in your project. When you generate an Angular application, it runs a generator. When you create a React application, it runs a generator. But it also runs when there's a migration or when something needs to change. So a generator doesn't only generate files, it also modifies the files as well. So what I wanted to do with the second approach was to create an app and then rename it. So I still had to create an app. So the generator had two responsibilities. One, to create the app, and the second, to add an executor in the project. As I said, I wanted to create and then rename it. So the project needs to know how to rename it. So I would add a rename or sort of an executor in the project JSON. This is how my code looks like. And the code is completely open source. All the applications are open source. You can just go and learn a lot just from the apps themselves that I have not put anything about in the book. So this is the code of my generator. It's just a function. It takes the project's JSON and adds this particular rename attribute to it. And this tells this project how to do the renaming, what executor to run. And this is the end result. So you can see in this particular project JSON, this is the end result where we have the recipe name containing two important components. The rename generator, or sorry, the rename executor requires two things, the chapter and the app. It needs the chapter so it can remove it from the chapter name or the whole recipe name and still keep the recipe name as it is. So I didn't want chapter 01 when running or serving the apps. The second part was to run the executor. So the plugin has generated an Angular app now. Now it needs to run the executor. It needs to read the project JSON, read the name of the app and the chapter, and then go inside the project JSON and other files and rename all the instances of chapter 1 CC input outputs to just CC input outputs. How many of you are still with me? Can I have a raise of hands? Good, thank you. Awesome. So this is the code of the executor. I'm just going to skip it. It's just a TypeScript function. Which means that when I'm creating an app, all I need to run is the command above, and that's pretty much it. I say, hey, create an app for chapter 1, which has the recipe name ng or cc ng on changes, and has the title to show in the header ng on changes. That's pretty much it. So creating 150 apps for me with the renaming is just one single command performed 150 times, but it still is faster. So the process looks like it runs a bash script that runs a generator to create the app, and then the executor to rename the application. If you dissect the whole command, as I mentioned, when we run npm run create, we go from the package JSON to the bash script. The bash script runs the generator and then the renaming. And this is the bash script. I've sort of made it a bit concise for readability, but it's a bit more complex than this. But this is the whole idea. It just cds into the folder, runs my particular plugin. As you can see, it says npx nxg on the fourth last line, cd start. And then it says code with Ahsan, ng cookbook recipe. So it's generating a recipe for me with all the parameters that I'm providing to it. Which means for this particular folder structure that I wanted, having a monorepo, workspace, and then chapters and recipes, I could just run this. npm run serve ccng on changes, because I've renamed the app already. So every new app now I create, I don't have to specify chapter number at all, and I don't even have to cd into the folder at all. So if you remember what our goal was, what was the goal that I mentioned I want you to remember? Great? Yes. So I think we achieved it, but to some extent. And to be honest, that was the time I thought I was over the moon. I did a lot of cool stuff, but more importantly, I actually got over the fear. And I had that for years. I did not know how Angular schematics work at all. That was a really important topic, but a really complex topic as well. And there are still, till today, no good videos on it, how to actually work with Angular schematics or how NX schematics work. If I got time ever, I'm going to try to create a video for that. But as I felt enlightened or happy, another problem knocked my door. Have you heard this term called consistency? We all want our code to be consistent throughout the project, but we also want great UI UX, and we also want great and consistent UI UX. The idea for me was to have the same layout for all the projects. That was one of the biggest reasons I started everything from scratch, so I can have a consistent layout through all my projects. Which means this was the layout. I wanted a header with the Angular logo, the title, an info button that the reader can go to and read more about the book. And then there's this container that you see which hosts the application itself. So I thought I could do the following in this particular case. Whenever I'm generating a new project, I would have a template for my index.html for the Angular app and the app component HTML also for the Angular application. The index.html is really important because it loads all the fonts that I want to have throughout my 150 plus projects. And it also has the icons that I want to use, which were material icons. And similarly, the app component had the structure of the header and the main container of the application. So this is how the index.html looked like. If you look at the 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th lines, you can see I'm loading some fonts there. I'm also loading material icons there. And since I'm generating a new application, every application has this index.html, so I don't have to copy-paste material icons 150 plus times. Secondly, for the app component, every app that I create with my plugin has this structure. It has a toolbar, and it has a main element inside which my code would go. So every app has this HTML by default. I don't have to copy-paste anything. But in all of this, we have just discussed HTML templates, index.html, app component HTML. Well, what about the biggest fear of web developers? This guy. How do we ensure that all the apps have the same styling, consistent styling? Do I need to copy-paste some SCSS file or CSS file 150 times? Is that the best way to go? No. This is when I created my own NX library. Because if you have a library, you can just use that in all of your projects. And when you change something, you just need to update the library, and all the projects get the updates. So I created an NX library, and I created a globals.scss file from here. Just creating a file is obviously not the end of it. You need to export this file using the packager, and then you also need to include it in all of the projects. So if I have a library that has a CSS file, when I create an application, I still want all of my projects to automatically load this CSS as well, or include this CSS as well. If you have worked with Angular or NX, you know that we have this angular.json that has the styles it needs to include, especially third party. And if you use NX, you have the project.json that it needs to include. So I added another function in my generator for loading the global CSS, as you can see, just before the end. And as I mentioned, we're not talking about 150 projects here now. We're talking about just 2 workspaces using the SCSS file once. And if I want to update anything, I just need to update my plugin, build it again, and then all the apps have the updated CSS again. And then the result was, can I have a drum roll? Thank you. This was the result. For all of my applications, I now had a header and a container where all of my applications would be hosted. And you can imagine how happy I was. And just as I thought everything was like butterflies and sunshine, something big happened. Can anyone guess what could have gone wrong in the process or outside of it? And this was the time when I was about to publish my book. Any guesses? You can raise your hand. No. Angular changed their logo. And I had 150 projects having the template that I use in the generator. And now I have 150 Angular logos which I need to update. And those are SVGs, not even a URL that I can just go and replace. So you can imagine the frustration I had. If you remember, this is what we had as the app component HTML. And this is what I needed to change. So as a good developer, I composed myself. I was like, OK, I need to do something about this. And the first thing that came to my mind was to update the app component template. Just go there and change it to the new logo. And change it from this to actually being a component that I can use from the library. So 150 projects using the component means if I need to change anything in the component, instant updates to all of them. Does that sound good to all of you? Can you raise your hand if this sounds good? Because it was too late. If you update the generator's code, you only influence the project I'm about to generate. So I already had created all the projects. What about my 150 cats, which have the old Angular logo? So I can't use the generator anymore. I started thinking about the solution to this. And these were my main questions. How do geniuses at Angular or NX solve such issues? How can I have a graceful fallback if I try to update all of these projects and something fails in the middle? And finally, how do I ensure if I have to go into the same situation again, I don't have to think all of this again? So I wanted this to be a bit future-proof. So first, I needed a header component. So I went to my library. I was like, OK, let's just create a header component, and then we'll see how to use that. Secondly, I stumbled upon this really cool thing that has been talked about today quite a lot, migrations. When NX updates Angular, it generates a migration. When Angular updates Angular, it generates a migration for us. And we can just go ahead and run those migrations, and it updates the whole code base. That's what I wanted to do. I wanted to update the whole workspace somehow. So essentially, this was the plan. My plugin needs to run a migration. My migration needs to run a generator. And that generator was replacing the app toolbar among all of my projects. And with migrations, it looks something like this on the bottom. You can specify if you're going to run a generator on it or an executor. And then you can give it a name. You can specify where the file of it is, as you can see in the implementation keyword. And then you can also specify which version of your plugin will apply this migration. So that's how NX and Angular control it. If you already are updated to, let's say, Angular version 18.2, no migrations would run for you. But if you are at 17 point something, the migrations will run for you in that particular case if you use Angular version 18, so to say. So the goal was to run the migration replace app toolbar in both the start and the final workspaces. So I wrote a migration script, and I'm going to show it to you quickly, if I can find my cursor. There it is. So this is the migration that I wrote. And what it basically does is that it goes into each project structure, each folder, gets the file, tries to read the HTML from it in the app component HTML for each project, and then it replaces it with the component. So if you see right here, it is replacing it with a new toolbar ngCBUI header. So I needed to do two things, basically. Go into each project, update the HTML, and then import the header component from my library into the TypeScript file as well, because otherwise it won't work. So that was the idea for this whole migration for me. And if I show you the commit of the replacing migrations, this is actually how it looked. I'm going to just show you the parts that are relevant. So when I ran the migration, and of course, as good developers, I tested it. I have a test in my repository to run the migrations. So if you see here, all the red is the old HTML. And you can see that I'm adding a new ngCBUI header here. So just by running one single command in my start and in my final project, I replaced all of my headers. It took a couple of days to figure this out, but I saved weeks. So if you see on the left side, all of these projects were basically updated. And that was the goal of it. All right, so once I ran the migration with this approach, things were muska, which we say in Pakistan for something like buttery smooth or butter. And I can show you what the final result looks like with everything done and my book ready to be shipped. This is an example of the new defer block in Angular that you might have heard of for performance optimization that you can use to lazily load components. So if I scroll down, this will load the new component, which means the JavaScript is not loaded until the user comes to this particular part. And then you can drag and drop, manage it pretty nicely, like this, blah, 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 and then you can load further. So this was the final result, and this was when I actually felt like a self-proclaimed NX expert. So if I summarize what we have done so far, or what we've understood so far is, cats are possum. Managing 150 plus cats or projects is completely possible. No solution is perfect. We always need to reevaluate and improve our solutions. And it's never too late to learn something new. As I mentioned, I was writing a book, and I didn't know a lot of stuff, both what I was about to write in the book and also about managing all of this as well. And we also learned that NX is actually really, really good for monorepositories and scaling and automating a lot of stuff as well. So as Santosh mentioned, it's a tool. It's a tooling company as well. With that said, thank you so much. There's a link at the top where you can just scan it, and you can give me feedback directly to how you liked the talk. And of course, ask any questions. Thank you.